apologetics, and that is, again, going through, right now, we're going through proofs of the existence of God. And last week we looked at causality, that every cause has an effect, and for every effect there was a cause. And if you trace it back, at some time there had to be a beginning. It's not something that's infinite. So today we're going to look at, again, another proof of the existence of God. This time, the idea of motion. Now, as we go through this, you may think it's a lot like causality, but it is different. And we'll get to that toward the end. So what is motion? Motion is any activity, either internal or external, either bodily or spiritual, that can be exercised in a finite being. So what does that mean? For example, walking, growing, singing, those are all motions. They're all actions that can be done by a finite being. Those are external actions, and they're usually bodily. An example of a spiritual internal action would be something like understanding something, learning something, making up your mind. Technically, the nitty-gritty of it, technically motion is a transition. That word is important, a transition from potentiality to actuality. When you study science, it talk about potential energy and kinetic energy. You know, everything has an energy, but it holds it until it's used and it becomes kinetic energy. Walking is potential energy being put into use, becoming kinetic. With that in mind, you're thinking along the same lines. Everything has a potential. Take all the chairs you need. Everything has a potential, meaning that it's capable of doing something or receiving something. Actuality is when that capability becomes a fact. So actuality is what something is, where potentiality is what it may become. So, for example, H2O, two molecules of hydrogen and one of oxygen, has the potential of becoming water. Water is the actuality. So water is the actual thing. The hydrogen-oxygen molecules are the potential. Now, that potential can become something else. It can become, instead of water, it can become combined with other molecules and become something else. So, but again, you have something that has a potential and it becomes an actuality. And that transition from one to the other is the motion. So, again, hydrogen and oxygen molecules can become water, but then you also have hot water that can become cold water. It can transition from one thing to something else. Hot water has the potential to cool off and become cold. Cold water also has the potential to become hot, but it takes energy to heat it. That's the next thing. Nothing ever moves from one thing to another by itself. There's always a force or something that needs to move it. So motion is always a thing that is given, conferred, transmitted, but it's never self-originating. It can't of itself move from one place to another. Now you say, well, I can walk from one place to another. Yeah, but not really the way we're thinking about it. We'll get to that in a minute. So, motion always requires two things. It requires a thing that is moved and a mover. A thing that is moved, and I'm the mover. Move it. The mover is always separate from the thing. The thing itself can't be the mover. It always requires something outside of itself to move it. Whatever is moved by something outside of itself. This is a law, and there are no exceptions. And when a law in science has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's no longer a theory, like evolution is a theory. It's a law, and this is a law, that nothing is moved, whatever is moved by something outside of itself. Lifeless matter can't move itself. Living things do, in quotes, move themselves, but not in the sense that they are the complete origin and source of that motion. Your muscles are what moves your body. Where do the muscles get the energy to move?
Sure.
From something outside of yourself. So, for example, a steam engine moves or is moved because steam forces the pistons to move back and forth. The pistons are rods that move the wheels. Where does the force in the steam come from? From the water. The water is being boiled. So the steam comes from the power of the fire, the action of the fire upon the water. Again, there's a series here. Kind of like in causality, there's a series. You trace things back. Where you can walk, fine. Where's the power in your muscles come from? From the food that you eat. Where does the food that you eat come from? Where does it get that energy? Well, it takes it from the sun and puts it into the leaves of plants or into the cow or whatever that you eat, who eats that plant and then becomes meat that you eat, and so on. Well, where does the sunlight come from? Again, it goes back. So, it's not self-originating. Ultimately, you can keep tracing it back to a first mover, the one that originally began the movement. And again, that you could call also the first cause, which gives all things being. So living plants, for example, living things such as plants move. What causes them to move? Laws of nature. The laws of nature are what gives them the idea of to move or how they move. It's a plant which, when the sun comes up, it uncurls its petals. Those are things put into it by nature. Animals move according to instinct. An animal will attack you because it feels it's threatened, or a bee knows where to go and get the honey. Again, it's all instinct. Man moves because his intellect or knowledge inspires him to do it. But no living thing gives itself life. And no living thing has the power of self-motion. Again, it always traces back to that first mover, the first cause. Nor do living things preserve itself in its activity. Again, the first mover also needs to be the preserver of that movement, or that thing that was created, or the thing that he set in motion. Because if he doesn't preserve it, the motion stops. In fact, when you die, your motion stops. Its being in motion depends ultimately upon that first cause, that first mover. Man can perceive objects, but they have to be objects that can be perceived. They have to be actual things. Or else the senses aren't stirred to any activity. Thus, neither sensation nor understanding are self-originating. Where do they come from? From your senses. Well, where do your senses get that information? From seeing something? From, again, outside of itself, outside of yourself. So even your knowledge and your internal movement come from something outside of yourself. And so neither sensation or understanding or self-originating, they depend upon an inner life principle, which didn't make itself, and upon objects of knowledge, which also did not make themselves. Wherever we find motion, we find that it is stirred into being by something outside of itself. And thus, there's a universal law that is universally true. Whatever is moved by something other than itself. That is the law. Whatever is moved by something outside or other than itself. Now, if everything requires a mover to be moved, it's obvious that there has to be a beginning to the chain of motion. The first mover, which is really first, and therefore, just like the first cause, it can't be moved by something outside of itself, because then it's no longer the first mover. That first mover has to be the beginning of the chain. Therefore, there can't be anything beyond it to move it. And yet, it has to be capable of moving other things and itself. So this first mover must be one. Since being truly the first mover, it's not subject to anybody else's movement or subject to another mover. So it can only be one. Just like the first cause could only be one. It causes motion, but itself is uncaused. So again, there's a connection between, we looked last time at causality, we saw that there was a first cause. We're looking at, again, we're always looking at God, but we're looking from a different perspective this time. But again, they cross each other. One rule doesn't rule the other out. And from looking at it from different perspectives, we will find also different things about this first cause and this first mover. So, the first mover has to be one, because it can't be something else moving it or causing it. And it causes motion by itself, and it is itself uncaused. So, we can identify the first cause of all things with the first mover, and they are both one and infinite. And we call that being God. So the syllogism, this time, last week we looked at a different one, the syllogism this time, the steps in the logic are this. First, the major premise. If there is motion in the world, then there's a mover. And ultimately, a first mover who is itself unmoved. That's the first premise. And we just went through that, the proofs of that. So, that's true. The second premise is now, there is motion in the world. The first one was, if there is motion in the world, then there has to be a first mover to set everything into motion. There is motion in the world. Therefore, there is a mover. And ultimately, a first mover, who is itself unmoved. And we call this person God. So, since the first two are true, the premise must be true. First two premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That there has to be a first mover, and we call him God. So, what kind of arguments are you going to find people put against this whole idea? And you will find them. You go to college, you will find these, or even out there, other places. So, we're looking at things that have been around and been discussed by philosophers for centuries. So back in the 5th century B.C., Protagoras, a Greek philosopher, asserted, and this is around today, but these things don't go out of vogue. They cycle back. And this is again present today, and you'll find it in modernist thinking. He asserted that we don't need to look at the origin for motion, since everything is in motion. And he said, nothing is, it's always becoming. In other words, there is no, everything is in motion. So you can't really look for a first motion. Everything is constantly evolving, is becoming, moving into something else. Now, sounds good, and a lot of people, uneducated college students would just grab onto that because their teacher says this, but because this idea is still around, as I say, around today. But think about it. It's self-contradictory. It contradicts itself. It asserts that everything is in a perpetual state of flux, of change, of motion. And if that's so, then everything is contingent and on this universal moving mass, but it doesn't explain itself. Even though everything is still moving, there still has to be a first mover who sets the whole thing in motion, the original mover. If you want to accept that idea, it doesn't negate the fact that they still had to start somewhere. So there is a need to look for the origin of motion. You just can't ignore it and say, oh, well, everything is in motion. We don't need to know where it started. Why? You just simply want to be an ostrich and stick your head in the ground and just say, oh, well, it's here, so who cares where it all came from? Also, movement means the leaving of one state of being for another. The leaving of potentiality for actuality. Now, a thing can't give itself what it doesn't possess. The new and perpetually renewed acquisitions of actuality must be given by something other than the thing that is moved. So those potentialities, those possibilities of becoming something else have to come from something outside of itself, again, from that first mover. Nor can moving things progress in a circular series, like passing mutations around in a ring, unless there's a supreme being who is unmoved, an unmoved supreme being, who's outside of that ring and setting everything in motion and watching over these mutations, this ring, and making sure everything is going the way it should. He has to sustain the motion. There is no case, even with the becoming theory that Protagoras put forward, that with that idea, that doesn't require the conclusion that motion requires a first mover that is unmoved. You just can't throw that out. You can ignore it, which is what he was doing, but ignoring something doesn't make it non-existent. It just means you're not looking at it, you're just ignoring it. I mean, you can be in a burning building and ignore the fire and let the house fall on you, but that's your problem, not mine. Other Greek philosophers argued that there was no motion at all. And this is observed and can be demonstrated instantly by just standing up. That is a motion. So the denial of motion also involves the denial of human knowledge and reason, which is an absurdity. So, in summary, here we've defined motion and the law that whatever is moved by something other than itself. And then we've identified that something other must be traced back to a first mover, who itself is unmoved, and therefore and can also be identified with the first cause that was itself uncaused. And both the first mover and the first cause we call God. Now, in the last class we learned that God in the first cause is one, infinite, eternal, and necessary. In this class, we learned that God is also not moved, and immovable. That is, he is immutable. You can't change. Change is a transition from one thing to something else. God doesn't change. He's immutable. He causes change, but he himself is outside of the change. And so he's immutable. So why is that important? Again, because we're looking at it from different directions, from the first cause, looking at it as the first cause, we saw certain aspects of what God has to be. That he's one, that he's necessary, that he's, he's eternal and infinite. From looking at it from the idea of motion, we see also another aspect of God, that he is immutable. Now, don't think that God's immutability is a small thing or unimportant. Keep that in mind, and it should be very important in the days to come, especially in the present modernism, the present crisis in the church, like the synod and synodality. Why? Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'm going to point this out to you right now. And I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't proven yet that Christ is the Son of God. We haven't proven yet that the Catholic Church is the true church, the church that Christ founded, and that if that is the way God wants us to worship him. I haven't gone through those proofs yet. That's what this whole course is this year. So I'm jumping ahead, but because I want to point out the importance of this idea of immutability. Because if God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ founded a church, and if that church is identified with him, since he is the church is the mystical body of Christ. Remember, I like to harp on that. That's because it's the foundation stone of our religion. That the church is Christ, the mystical body of Christ. And that as members of the mystical body, we are incorporated in Christ. And if God is immutable, then the doctrines that make up the church, the doctrines given to us by Christ, God himself, are also immutable and can't change. The church, therefore, can't change. Say that to yourself every night before you go to bed. The church can't change because they're trying to, the present pope and the sycophants who follow him are trying to push this down your throat, that the church can evolve. The church can change. Then we need to change the doctrines of the church to make it, to be one with our separated brethren and everybody get along together and we can change the doctrines on marriage and divorce and abortion and homosexuality and all these kind of things. No, we can't. The doctrines in the church, like God, because the church is God, are immutable, unchangeable, regardless of the synod, whatever the synod and synodality comes out with. Just keep it in mind, and keep, don't buy that falsehood. That's modernism. One of the premises in modernism is that the church evolved. That Christ himself evolved. That when he was, he didn't know that he was God. It kind of came on him gradually over, as you grow up and, went through those public life. I'm the Messiah, I must be the Son of God. Come on. Do people really believe that? Yes, they do. and they're going to try and force you down your throat. So just, I just wanted to throw that in there because that's where this is all going. Nothing changes. Just dressed up, with new window dressing and put out there again in a different way. So, any questions on this? Yes. Yes. You hold fast to the Catechism of Trent. That is really the best catechism. The Baltimore Catechism, those are all offshoots from it, but they're also influenced by the nations that put them out. Hold fast to the Council of Trent Catechism. There is a listing of all the doctrines that we as Catholics believe. Know it backwards and forwards and inside out. And when somebody, whether it's your priest, your bishop, your best friend, your parent, your sister-in-law, tells you something different, you don't need, you can argue with them, but sometimes it's not really the best way to go, especially if they're relatives or, arguing with the priest might be disrespectful, but you might point out some errors to him, but if he insists, then just walk away. But you hold fast to it. Don't you be influenced. You need to, and that's why you need to know your religion. And if you have any questions about it, go back over the catechism questions, all the religion that I put up on the website. Go back over it again and again and again until you can do it in your sleep. And when somebody asks you some kind of question, what does it mean when you say that the church is infallible? And you can answer. Well, how can you prove that there is a God? Yes. That's what we've been working on. You still got 3 more proofs. There are more than that, but we've looked at 2. The one that most people know is the one we did last week, causality. It's one of the most obvious in-your-face proofs. Not too many people look at this one. But there are points to look at it. As you see, from looking at it from a different perspective, you learn another thing about God. And you have to remember philosophers, which is where all of this stuff comes from. And some of these were pagan philosophers that started all of this. They look at things from a different perspective than we do, but you can still learn from it. They were trying to prove that there was a God, but they weren't trying to prove that it was the God you believe in. And they weren't trying to prove it was their God, whoever it was. But the proof's still valid. We're just going to change the outlook as we add more to it and take what they have and throw out the different things that other people want to throw in there that to prove to you, that you will find in the marketplace, in the school, so that you're prepared when somebody or when your Pope tells you something that, is wrong. Yes.
So I think it's a good time for everyone to fall to this because for years in public school, which mostly everyone's educated in, have been pushing evolution on all the children.
Yes.
I'm 40. I know it felt to me like it was the truth. And you can question it when you're a child, thinking, even if you're taught right, you can question it and just kind of start believing it as evolution. Yeah, evolution.
Yeah, because you say, well, they know so much more than I do. They're my professor in college. They're my teacher.
Yeah,
and little kids will, everything the teacher says, they believe.
Yeah.
And that's why I teach my kids, question me. If I ever say, I want you to question me. I want you to examine everything that I say, and if you see anything that you think is funny or wrong, point it out to me, and then I'll show you why I say that. But also because you need to get into the habit of questioning everything that's given to you. Whether even if Father DeMeyer were to say something from the pulpit, look at what he says. If ever he says anything that is different than the Council of Trent, question him on it.
It would be easy if people think that everything is evolving. It would be easy to say that the churches should evolve for a positive cause, which is harmony with other humans.
Yes.
Which is not really the truth, but so I just for the people who are in this class that maybe are younger, I think it would just be good to remember Genesis 1 and 2, and if everything in the causality that you're talking about and in the movement. Because in the beginning God created heaven and earth. The earth is without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving.
Yes.
And there it is. That was the beginning.
Yes.
That was the cause, and there was the beginning movement. I just learned that in a little kid's memory class, which helped me. But, so as a Catholic that actually knows the faith, just remember that, and don't let your teacher up there say, oh yeah, we evolved from monkeys or whatever, and just, think about the beginning.
In a practical way, I tell my kids to answer when they're in public speeches like that the book says that. We send it to them as the truth. Right. We just go, well, this author said, because they're going to have to answer back.
Right. And they're going to have to put it down on a test and say, well, like you say, the book says, or you don't necessarily have to say, but that's totally wrong. But just,
And the other one is, I tell them, play by their rules, so you can play by your rules. They want you to play by their rules.
Right, or they'll tell you.
Yes. So is that something that you believe?
No.
You just pretend until you're in power.
Exactly. It's being diplomatic. It goes on in government all the time.
Is it heretical to believe in the Big Bang?
No, it's not heretical. It's kind of stupid, but...
Is it wrong to believe that it took more than actual 7 rotations of the Earth to be built?
We were just talking about that yesterday. I had some ladies come for, actually it was Friday, for vestment making class. They wanted to know how to do embroidery, and during lunch we were talking about that. And I said, God's day, first of all, it says, who knows how long a day was? And this, the modernists will latch onto this too. How long? God didn't create. We measure a day by rotation of the sun, but God didn't make the sun until the 4th day. So how did they measure the first 3 days? It's God's idea of what a day was. He inspired the person who wrote it that this was a day. It may be in the vision that he saw the creation of the world, that's the way he defined it. But it doesn't matter. You can just say, it could be 24 hours. The day could have been as long as a second. God is not limited by time. Remember, God is outside of time. He's in a dimension totally his own. Time is a dimension, and he looks at everything, as I said, this way, not like a moving picture that's going on, there's the past, present, future. No, everything, past, present, future is right here, right now. Everything is present with God. He doesn't need days. That was whoever the writer of Genesis, whether it was Moses or somebody passed on to Moses, the writer of Genesis saw it. Again, God inspired him to write it this way. Maybe he showed him the creation in a vision, and he saw it as a day. It doesn't really matter. It all comes down to the fact that God made it. And he's not limited by, time at all.
Are we supposed to take literally the age of the early Bible folks, 900 years old?
Yes. You don't have to take it literally, but I do.
Well,
because, first of all, if you notice, the ages decreased after the flood. The world was very different before the flood. and people could live that long. After the flood, maybe there's more radiation and ultraviolet, because there's no longer the same cloud cover that there was before the flood, that people didn't live as long. And you see them slowly decreasing in age.
The reason I ask that is, why didn't Adam have hundreds and hundreds of children? Or did he?
He did.
But we just
He had a
don't know.
lot. He had a lot
Well, he
more
should,
than
not
the
hundreds.
3 mentioned in the Bible, but yeah, he had a lot. He had to have daughters too,
Wouldn't work out.
Right, exactly.
Didn't diet play a lot to do with that age?
We did what? Diet? Yes. They didn't eat meat at all before the flood. Yeah.
We don't know how
No more
long
meat for any of
Adam
you.
and Eve were in the garden, right?
Right, we don't. There was no time given as to that period. I mean, he didn't keep a calendar. We're just, what is Adam's age is given, 900 some years old. And think about it. He lived to see great grandchildren.
More than that.
900 years is a long time.
So when they try to argue that the world is very, very extremely ridiculously old,
Yes. And there's
Maybe
so
you-
much, in the Bible history class that I've been teaching, we went through that and we showed that there is no evidence. All the evidence stacks up against the Bible being, all the evidence stacks up as a young earth instead of an old earth is what they're trying to do. Instead of being millions or billions of years old. 10,000 years is a good number.
The Jews put it at 5,000 some odd years old, the earth. They've supposedly been calendarizing it in Moses' day.
Yeah, but you have to, from Moses' day, but consider that before Moses, you had another 1,400 years. I mean, when you, even more than that, if you were to, remember, Adam lived to 900. So if you, it's just 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham, and Abraham to Moses, about another 500. So you have at least another 2,500 years you want to add on there. We're close to 10,000. I mean, most Bible scholars adding up all the dates in the Bible, guess to be the world to be between 8 and 10,000.
Is the Catholic Church okay with understanding the universe as galaxies, stars, and planets, and solar systems?
Yeah.
The relativity of time that's just described in Genesis could still apply too.
Yeah, exactly.
So quantification of time,
Uh-huh.
10,000 years ago,
Yeah.
is it a revolution around?
Yeah, because
the sun? No.
we didn't start counting time until man shows up.
Right.
So,
Did God create time when He created His sun? That has something to happen.
and yet we're counting days before He creates the sun. At least 3 days before that. So how long is that period?
Well, but in the interest of God, it's
Yeah.
consequential over time.
Exactly.
If everything's present.
Yeah,
previous,
exactly.
current.
Doesn't matter. It's up for grabs, whatever you want. But the whole idea, the whole idea of a man evolving from something, the church accepts that. I mean, the church way back, I want to say, which pope was it? I don't think it was Pius XII. But anyway, one of the popes said, yes, we can accept. They asked him, is the evolution, is that, like you say, heretical? He says, you can accept it. You can accept the idea as long as you understand that at some point, when that mass of tissue becomes a human being, a living, thinking human being, God infused a soul into it. That's what made it a living human being, and that person we call Adam. You can believe it. You can believe all that as long as you put that step in there somewhere. But when you think about it, why not just skip all this and go right to here? God doesn't need to go through all those steps. He can make in an instant a fully formed human being with a soul that we call Adam instantly, since he's also the one who could create thousands of galaxies instantly. And we're not limiting him. If you do want to limit him, who do you think you are? I hope I'm making sense. So, you can go the evolution route as long as you want to put that in there. But to me, that is just as ridiculous and just as far-fetched as, even more so than just saying, well, it started at the beginning. This God created Adam, and then Eve.
But also, they like to say that, because my father was told by Catholic school, that Adam and Eve are figurative.
Yeah.
So there's
And
also
that there was
modern
more than
heritage.
one human Adam in all different parts of the world. Man evolved, and they were showing up in different parts of the world. And yet they cannot produce a missing link. They cannot produce fossils to show us that, that it happened even in one place, much less several places in the world. Give me the evidence. There is the evolution is a theory. It's not a law. Yeah, Luna?
I was thinking that I was confused. I wanted to know if God created life in another planet. I was all about this planet.
Yeah.
But then
We have enough problems in this world. Why do we want to go to another one?
No, about this.
My attitude to that, because again, in high school, that question came up. Again, we had some modern people trying to teach in high school, and my attitude, I've always looked at it as, first of all, Adam and Eve, when they were put on this earth in the Garden of Paradise, they committed a sin. And God had to become man to die to redeem us from that sin. If God created life on another planet, this is kind of, if you ever want to really get into this, though I thought of this long before I read the book, read C.S. Lewis's Portlandia theory. Out of the Silent Planet, His Strength, and Portlandia, that 3-book series. It kind of covers this whole idea that God creates living beings on another planet, but they also have to be tested, but they don't fail the test. So aliens from other planets, would God ever let people who have not failed the test ever meet up with people who did? What was his point?
If there are other worlds, Jesus has been busy.
Yeah, I don't think he would send his son to die over and over again in a